First person I'm going to introduce is the editor-in-chief, the new editor-in-chief of Gizmodo.com. Newish. He is also the author of an upcoming book for FSG Originals called...
Subtle, John, subtle.
I just wrote this. Literally. He's on his yeah. He's a very nice guy. And he is the author of the book that's coming out soon called A Burglar's Guide to the City. And it is a look at how burglary and architecture sort of interact and go hand in hand or not, sort of. We'll hear more about that. And he's also the editor of a really great blog called Building Blog, which I'm sure you've all read. Okay, it's Jeff Mayo. Come on up.
Hey everybody.
The stage actually moves. Our second esteemed guest speaker is the author, most recently, of Dead Pig Collector, a really awesome book that costs 99 cents. 99 cents. And it's really good.
And also.
And awesome. He is also the author of an upcoming book of nonfiction, his first, for FSG as well. It's coming out next year. And he has a long career that everyone knows about in comic books that has Thor and Iron Man on his resume. And he's also written all of like 1,000 other things, including the amazing Transmetropolitan graphic novel series, and Red, and so many other things.
Planetary.
Yes! That is
Low
amazing.
frequency. Desolation Tone. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm throwing my voice.
He also flew in from England today to be with you guys. Ellis.
I've been awake since about New York, since about midnight EST, so don't expect much.
All right, you guys have a blast. What are you guys going to talk about? Murder first?
Yeah, I think we'll start off with some murder.
That's a great topic to start with. All right, you guys, have fun.
Murder.
Yeah.
So that's me, isn't it?
That is.
I got elected to be the murder person somehow. I don't know how you work for that, Jeff. I mentioned I've been awake since midnight, right? Yeah. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. There we go. Right, wave a beer bottle or something. That always works. Murder. What have I got to say about murder? I've done no preparation. God, was that me? Mogo. We're going to talk about murder. We have to talk about Mogo. Mogo was a farmer in Kenya in 1929, Kenya province. He was a squatter farmer, which meant he worked on land owned by a landowner, and he had the right to graze his own livestock and build a hut along with the other squatter farmers. He was on contract. And one day in 1929, Mogo had a very bad day because his contract was severed by the landowner because he was a wizard. Mogo was a wizard and people didn't like that. And it was causing a lot of untoward commotion on the farm. Work wasn't getting done. People were complaining because he was, after all, a fucking wizard. And so he was fired. and told to leave the land by the end of the day. So Mogo went back to the little squatter farmer village to collect his stuff, and then to go to the hut of the first person there who had accused him of being a wizard some time ago, and killed him with a spear. And then he killed his wife with a spear, and then his daughter with a spear, and then 9 other people with a spear, which of course raised alarm. The landowner sent for the local police. The police arrived to find Mogo gathering up his livestock with whatever possessions he had ready to go. And they said, "Mogo, you are a wizard and you appear to have killed quite a lot of people. What's the deal?" Mogo quite cheerfully showed them the 12 corpses, 12 people he killed, and then he turned to the landowner who had accompanied the police and demanded his severance paid before he left. Because Mogo was a murderer, and murderers are all about making their lives better. This is the root of murder. We kill people because they annoy us. You look at most non-pathological murder cases, and it's about someone removing someone else from their lives who is impairing their ability to live happily. In Mogo's case, all these people had called him a fucking wizard. And in fact, his wife wouldn't sleep with him anymore because he was a wizard. And his daughter wouldn't give him food because he was a wizard. And he knew that if he had left these people alive and gone to somewhere else, the rumour would have followed, "Mogo, he's a fucking wizard, you know. Don't give him anything to eat." In order to live well, in order to live happily, in order to improve his own quality of life, he needed to kill 12 people with a big sharp shitty stick. This is what murderers do. They are the impassioned hobbyists of the field of death. Which of course makes them interesting. But it comes down to murder is the exertion of will against the things that make your life that which you do not want. It's exertion of will to improve how you live. Most murders are about making the murderer happier. We kill the people who annoy us. We kill the people who bug us. We kill the people who bog us down and make life sad and grey and dark and dull and flat and ordinary. These are the people we kill. This is why most murders are domestic, because the person we kill pisses us off and makes us sad. And this is why Agatha Christie always said murder is easy.
Well, yeah, I'm here to talk about burglary, and I suppose, yeah, a little introduction to why one would talk about burglary. Burglary, I suppose, is about getting something that you want that's guarded by architecture. And I guess I realized over the years while working in architecture, but as an educator, but as a writer, that architects like to think that they're the only people thinking about the built environment, that they look at buildings in a particular way, that they have a gift for sort of understanding the city or understanding built space. But what's really fascinating is that when you look at crimes of burglary, burglary requires architecture. The burglar is a kind of rethinks the built environment in a really fascinating way of kind of unpuzzling the way that you get from A to B without following the route that an architect might expect or a homeowner might expect. And so if you kind of start pulling on the string of the sweater there and looking at the burglar as a kind of urban expert or as a kind of architectural expert, it leads to some pretty interesting places. And well, I think we'll actually talk about much of this over the course of the evening. But yeah, I suppose one place that I find really interesting to start is actually what is burglary? You know, is burglary the same thing as theft? Is it the same thing as robbery? Is it the same thing as trespassing? And what's really interesting actually is that that argument goes on and on and on, and you can trace it back to the legal journals and academic even conferences and even just law that varies from state to state and country to country. But basically burglary requires the entry into someone else's structure. You have to get across this thing that's been now legally codified as the close. So it's basically an invisible barrier that stands between you and whatever might be inside something else. And so this comes up all the time. Like if I go up to a convertible car that's parked on the sidewalk, or excuse me, parked on the street, or like a Jeep that's kind of open to the elements, and I reach in and I take something, have I just stolen something, or have I committed an act of burglary? If you have a screened-in porch, and maybe one of the screens has been cut through, and I reach in and I grab a glass that's on a table and I take it, have I burgled your house, or have I just robbed you of something? Have I stolen it? And what's really interesting is that architecture starts getting involved in this thing that's almost like Judaic midrash, where people argue back and forth about whether or not you've entered something or whether or not you haven't, what part of your body has crossed the threshold, and where was that threshold in the first place. And so you get into these little things where even if the tip of my finger crosses over a windowsill, if I come up and I ring your doorbell and I put my hand on the door on a windowsill that might be slightly open, I can actually be accused of burglarizing your house, even if I've stolen nothing. And so you start getting into this kind of weird, almost like interdimensional weave of surfaces that are being argued back and forth between police and lawyers and cops. And it even got to the point where there are fascinatingly sort of sardonic legal papers published in the 1940s and 50s, kind of warning everybody, like, let's like calm down and take a step back. Burglary is turning into this insane mathematical exercise where we're going to be arguing over abstract volumes and geometries for generations to come, where nothing is actually being stolen. People are simply interacting in spatial ways that they would have been doing generations ago, but burglary is now encompassing the movement of human beings through space in a really fascinating and unexpected way. And so the idea is that we have to stop this. We have to define what burglary might be. I mean, in a way that isn't just this loosely amalgamated geometry of invisible geometric shapes. But so, again, like pursuing where these kinds of arguments and whatnot might go, you get into this sphere of, breaking and entering, finding buildings that have outer perimeters and maybe some that don't, like whether or not if a roof extends out over a yard, and I go under that roof if I burglarize your house as opposed to just simply trespassing across your yard. And so I guess like diving into this kind of abstract mathematics of space is where the interest in burglary came from, and the notion that burglary is this really undefined thing. And so really briefly, there was a really great paper that was trying to quantify when burglaries happen. And one of the examples it gave was that burglaries in China tend to occur, something like 85 to 90% of them occur between, I think it was like 11 degrees Fahrenheit and 93 degrees Fahrenheit, which happens to coincide with the entire temperature range of basically that city. And so these kinds of absurd attempts to define when burglary might happen, where it might happen, what kinds of spaces people enter, is a sort of a Monty Python sketch going on behind the scenes between police and lawyers, and that's one of the things I think is really interesting about it. It's a topic that no one even seems to be able to define.
I'm kind of interested because it kind of reminded me of some of the things Adam Greenfield has been talking about lately. It's almost like you're both sort of backing from talking about urban spaces and cities into politics, almost, because when you're talking about the definitions of burglary, you're certainly talking about politics. And I'm just wondering, is that where anyone who starts thinking about urban spaces naturally ends up?
Well, at the very least, yeah, you end up talking about economics and ownership and where one space begins and another one ends, and what can be occupied and what can't be, and who has legal right to enter a space that someone else might not. And I mean, an interesting example of where burglary touches into political problems is there's one guy who has written a paper where he basically theorizes that one of the reasons why U.S. burglary law is written in the way it is was specifically that British people from Colchester, England, came over in the 1700s, and Colchester had a kind of anti-royalist attitude towards the Queen's soldiers, and it was the first city in England to pass a law that said that the Queen's soldiers cannot enter houses without the explicit permission of the homeowner. So in a vampiric nature, you had to invite them in, they couldn't just come in. And then according to this guy's legal theorizing, all of these people from Colchester happened to come over to the United States at a very fertile time for writing the political nature of ownership and space. And so Colchester, England is sort of forensically present in US burglary law. Which
I find weird, because Colchester was the old Roman capital of Britain. It's where the Romans colonised first, because it had the oysters. Nothing else at all to recommend Colchester. It's a toilet with its own weather system. But it had oysters, so that's where the Romans settled first. Claudius, I think, visited Colchester. It was the seat of pre British royal family authority.
Yeah.
So, odd place for that to come from.
It's like the return of the repressed or something.
A little bit. Is it my turn now?
I think it is, yeah.
Oh God.
What's next on the docket?
What's next? It was,
Hitman.
was it? It was Hitman. It was Hitman, wasn't it? Because I just wrote a short story about Hitman. Dead pig collector. The professional side of death. The people who kill people but really do care about being caught because they want to keep doing it because they're paid for it. The hitmen, the assassins. The assassin, I mean, as you know, is the corruption of Hashishin. Hassani Sabah founded them in the 1100s in Alamut. But so the story went, they were called the Hashishin because they used hashish as part of their rituals, and apparently that's not true. Marco Polo made that up years later, and a 19th century Orientalist compounded the mistake. It means something else. It's a slightly rough term in that language. But hashishin or hashishia means without any explanation. Because the hashishin or the hashishia were hitmen who operated in public in daylight. That was their innovation. They decided someone needed to be killed, they would do it in broad daylight, in public. So they were about the projection of death without any explanation, which relates obviously to terrorism, but also to snipers and to professional hitmen. The Hashishin persisted way past Hassani Sabah, who died at the ripe old age of 74, having gone outdoors for the last 35 years. The cult, there were grandmasters, I love that, grandmasters of assassins, of the Hashishin. But eventually they fell apart, and the Hashishin went their own ways, but the training was handed down. And by the time they got to Europe, the word was corrupted to assassin, which meant, which was taken to mean professional murderer. So this went on for hundreds of years in this style, and the hashish stuff sadly appears to be mostly apocryphal. Although there is a lovely story of, I think it's supposed to be the Grand Master after Hassani Sabah, where they still used religious notions to control the various tiers of hashishin, because there were four, maybe five different levels of hashishin, and they still use the stories about, you know, if you die in the service of the hashishin, then you will go to heaven and everything will be lovely. And this is like 1 or 2 generations down, they felt they needed to reinforce this. So they were very big on stagecraft. They took one of the hashishin and they buried him up to his head in this grand hall. They just lifted up the flagstones and they buried this guy up to his head. And they took a corpse from someone they'd gotten bored and killed earlier, and sort of laid it there so it looked like this guy was a severed head next to his body. Lots of blood around and smoke, and they brought the younger candidates in, and this head spoke. The Grand Master had power, you see, from beyond the grave, and he could summon up one of his lost warriors to explain how cool it was in heaven. You know, the virgins and the booze and the drugs and hanging out with God and whatever, watering pot plants, whatever the hell you do. So they did this whole thing with this guy buried up to his neck, pretending to be a severed head that's speaking from beyond the grave, which worked. And I imagine the conversation, because I know what happened next, I imagine the conversation. They take all the younger candidates out, and there's the Grand Master sitting there, and there's his mate down there pretending to be a severed head. And the severed head guy saying, well, I thought that went terribly well, didn't you? And the Grand Master saying, yes, terribly well. Yes, I was really very good. There's only one problem, which is, what if they see you walking around tomorrow?
Oh boy.
And then cut the guy's head off. and put it on a spike outside the building.
Wow.
Which is the usual end of the professional hitman, unfortunately. They get hit by someone else. They are no longer useful. They know too much because they've been working for the same clients for too long. Even the most successful, there was this Russian guy who worked through the 90s and 2000s, who is the only guy in real life people know of who would do the John Woo thing with 2 guns. He was the only ambidextrous gun-using hitman anyone's ever heard of. And he ended up getting hit in prison because 2 guns, very scary. 2 toothbrushes, not so much. But I have more sympathy with the professional killers than I do the murderers, as I spoke about earlier, because they're just there to do a job. It's a service. You can't do someone down for wanting to provide a service. And you have to assume that most of the people they killed were annoying anyway.
Form of workers' rights. What's funny,
real quick, Warren, because we're all drinkers. What's the killer's drink? I'm trying to remember that. Isn't there a famous kind of what a killer drinks before he goes on to do his job?
That depends by culture.
Pepsi.
No. The American killer drink. I want to say it's like capoeira or something like that, or do you know what I'm talking about at all? Caprianos. What's it called? Caprianos. Have you heard this? That's a killer drink.
I haven't heard this. You should be up here.
No. Well, Wikipedia. Sorry.
No, it's fine. Talking about assassins and hitmen and snipers and that kind of thing reminds me of one of my favorite articles of clothing is this thing called a ghillie suit. And basically it's a way in which a human being can dress like a plant. And, one of the things
the way you said that, I thought you owned one.
I was going to wear one today.
I was going to say.
But so aside from sort of like turning human culture into this weird way of camouflaging yourself with the landscape, one of my favorite stories of burglary is a man out in Oregon who put on a ghillie suit, he dressed up like a plant, and then he robbed a building, he burglarized the building, and the building that he robbed was a museum of minerals. Actual photographs of the burglar show him dressed up like a plant, and he's apparently had his minerals confiscated from him. But it's kind of this crisscrossing of the landscape fields here.
How many people actually know what he's talking about when he says a ghillie suit? Alright, imagine a mass of stringy moss, alright, has just been vomited over you by the swamp thing. That is seriously what a ghillie suit looks like. You've got to imagine these long strands of moss that break up the human figure and just make you look like a tree took a shit.
The key difference being that amidst all of this moss, there happens to also be a 4-foot sniper rifle sticking out.
Only this guy.
But I guess one of the things that I wanted to talk about in this kind of little segment was just was bank robbery. The idea of the bank robber as almost someone with a very specific financial goal, somebody who knows where the money is and they're gonna go and get it. And one of my favorite stories of all time from bank robbery is actually an unsolved crime from 1986 in Los Angeles. I could talk about this thing for hours, so I'll try to do the compressed version. But they were known as the Hole in the Ground Gang, and you'll shortly find out why. So there's a bank which now is actually across the street from a Chipotle. It's in West Hollywood, and it's now a talent agency. So if you're an aspiring model, you might actually be in this place. And it's now all the tunnels beneath it are filled up with popcorn cement, so they're kind of like a Rachel White Reed sculpture underground. But so basically, workers in this museum began to notice that weird things were happening. Like the electricity would flicker on and off, the phones would go off, would disappear and then come back on. And then one night at around like maybe 9:30 or 10, a manager was in the bank doing some spreadsheets and that kind of thing, when all of a sudden the Muzak turns on. And they started thinking, my God, we're haunted by a poltergeist. And they literally thought this, and they also went to the police and said, what's happening? Like, we hear noises, the music is turning on and off. off. Is it the Conjuring or what is it? And so they analyzed the vault. They looked to see, has anyone been in here? Have you guys been robbed? They decided, no, there's nothing to worry about. It must be a rat. So they thought, okay. They went back to everyday life and scared of poltergeists, etc., etc. And so one day they came in after a 3-day weekend, and the vault had been robbed. And not only was something like $175,000 worth of cash, but they estimate maybe $2.5 to $3 million of stuff was taken out of the safe deposit boxes. But so then they found a hole in the ground, obviously, in the floor, and they looked down and they began to search what was down there and where these people had come from. And so the basic theory was that these people were so good at tunneling that they potentially were mining engineers. At the very least, they had worked in construction, and there's even a chance that they were connected to the LA Water and Power company, because this is the other aspect of the story that's so freaking amazing, was that they actually took Suzuki four-wheelers underground through the sewer system, blocks and blocks and blocks away. And the only way that they would know that these particular sewer tunnels would come anywhere near the bank was if they had either had access to off-limits maps of the sewer system for Los Angeles, or if they knew that how the old rivers used to work in Los Angeles. So all the sewers are built on old stream beds and small rivers and that kind of thing. So you had to either be a hydrological historian, or you had to be a sewer worker, or you just had to have dumb luck. And so they had these Suzukis underground, and then they had two other engineering marvels that were so incredibly amazing. So one is that it's Los Angeles. It's arguably in a desert. At the very least, it's in a very arid region. So there's not a lot of stormwater down there, but when it does come, it really builds up fast. And so they basically became these kind of amateur hydro engineers. So they started building a little dam inside the sewer. And even the smallest trickle of water after a certain amount of time is going to form a pond, and that's going to become a lake. And so they built up this dam, and they would leave it up there for a few nights, and the water would come up. And meanwhile, they'd have all of the dirt that they had been digging out of the walls. They'd leave footprints everywhere. And then they would just release the dam. All of the water would flow out. It would wash everything out to further down into Los Angeles and eventually out to sea. And so they kind of like used the dam, or the improvised dam, as a burglary device. But then on top of it, what they found was that once they got close enough to the bank, they could just wire themselves into all of the cables and wires that were in the bank itself. Thus the poltergeist that was making the music go off and making the telephones go down. And they hooked up pavement saws, they hooked up concrete cores, and they did it all so well that when the FBI investigated it, apparently when they showed these photographs of the crime scene to professional concrete engineers and people who did boring, etc., the example they gave was that they whistled with appreciation. And then what's fascinating is they disappeared. So nothing happened. It's 1986, they disappear. And then 1987 comes around, and they didn't really learn from certain aspects of the crime that there's not enough time to get into. But all of a sudden, an alarm goes off. And this is actually, anyone from LA here would know it. It's at Pico and La Cienega, I think. So there's now like an art supply store and there's a Bank of America still there and a gas station. And so they struck again. But unfortunately they fucked up and they didn't do the poltergeist thing. So what happened, in other words, is that when they finally did trigger the alarm, they actually thought it was a bank robbery. They called the police, they came downstairs, they came in, they found, like basically would have caught the guys within 5 minutes, but they disappeared into their little gopher network and fled. But so, first of all, to this day, the crimes have never been solved. But second of all, when the FBI went down into this underground world, they found that there were actually not just one, but 2 tunnels, and they were going to simultaneously rob banks that would have been, according to the FBI, the largest bank robbery in the history of the world up to that moment, where they could have gotten anywhere from $15 to $30 million worth of stuff out of these vaults in 1987. And so the thing is, I actually had lunch with the FBI agent who was tasked with investigating this, and he's a really great guy. He's written a fantastic book. It's called Where the Money Is, of all things. It's like the most rip-roaring FBI memoir. Genuinely enjoyable, actually. And but the funny thing is that this thing is clearly stuck in his craw. And so, in fact, I think some of these images are we might have seen them already, but he showed up at lunch and he had a little folder with him that was called Tunnel Job, and he knew that I was excited about this thing, and he was too. And so he took out all these glossy photographs, and we were looking at the pictures of where this thing might be. And he actually joked that one of the reasons he wrote the book was that he was hoping the Hole in the Ground gang would effectively come out. It's beyond the statute of limitations, and so he was joking that they could walk into LAPD tomorrow. They could show up with the concrete coring equipment. They could have blueprints of the LA sewer system. They could explain how they did it, and they couldn't be arrested. And the FBI guy said the most we could do is we could take them out for a drink at the and just talk about what they did.
It's kind of hard to imagine anyone in LA with that kind of work ethic.
So it's that kind of stuff that, yeah, makes not only bank robbery fascinating, but just the general burglary an unbelievably endless topic.
Well,
I think it's your turn.
not endless, because you've got to finish the book.
Right
I think that's it at this point. There was 1 H, 2 H, excuse me.
We were going to do secret agents. For you.
Oh God, were we? Why were we? I can't agree to that. I've been calm. Secret agents. Why on earth secret agents? There's the book. He said trying to distract the audience. There's the book. Secret agents. Secret agents? What on earth did we ever reach that? Why would secret agents have come up? Because of Red? Maybe. I still haven't seen Red 2, I have to say.
They sometimes kill people?
Sorry?
They sometimes kill people?
They do. We've got a bit of a scandal in Britain right now where an MI5 agent, MI5 makes in domestic security service, was found naked inside a large kit bag that had been padlocked from the outside, and apparently it was suicide.
Yeah.
And you know, that would have been within a year of Alexander, what was his name? I want to say Litchenko, who was a Russian oligarch come pacifist who was poisoned with polonium, quite obviously by Russian secret services in Britain, because say what you like about British food, we don't tend to serve polonium in restaurants. If nothing else, it's probably a little bit high end for us. And in fact, the same polonium isotopes have apparently just been found in the tissues of Yasser Arafat, who was supposed to have died of something else entirely. I don't remember what. I remember there was a rumour that Yasser Arafat's sweat was so appalling that his clothes basically had to be burned after he wore them. You kind of wonder now how much of that might have been due to radiation poisoning. So yeah, I'm all kind of all at sea now. I wasn't expecting that. I forgot about this bit. So secret agents. I mean, these are the things that occur to me, and again, it brings us back to murder. Litvinchenko, which I think was his name, was attempted to cause trouble for Putin abroad. The guy naked in the holder who killed himself had definitely been working for GCHQ, who we now know were carrying water for the NSA through the prison program, and have now been implicated in spying on all kinds of people we weren't supposed to be spying on at America's behest. The Five Eyes program, which was supposed to be Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and another province I can't remember, were supposed to share information without spying on each other, but GCHQ at the NSA's bequest were spying on all of those and feeding all that data back to America, often with nothing in return. Because we have this thing called the special relationship, which has never been more wonderfully pictured than that footage from that G8 meeting where the special relationship is illustrated by George Bush talking to someone else, George W. Bush, excuse me, talking to someone else, and then turning back into the room and yelling, "Yo, Blair." At which point you saw British Prime Minister Tony Blair bounce up through the room, "Yes, George." which led to one of the greatest breaches of protocol in the House of Commons, Houses of Parliament, which are very much ruled by protocol. There are specific ways in which you address other politicians in the House of Parliament. But that day, everybody who stood up at question time to ask something of the Prime Minister, of course, began their question with, "Yo, Blair!" And it would seem to me, looking broadly at the situation, this would probably have been around the time when Britain started sharing intelligence with America that it was not supposed to, while of course getting nothing back, because the nature of the special relationship is Britain really, really wants America to like it. And there's a British term for the American attitude, which is treat them mean, keep them keen. It's rather embarrassing. But what can you do? At least we haven't renamed the country Airstrip 1 yet.
Well, the funny thing was like, when that, I guess it was about a year ago, when that guy was found in the bathtub, zipped up in his suicide.
Yes.
They actually,
suicide kit bag.
one of the ways in which they tried to determine that it was suicide was they went through this elaborate, I heard this on NPR, where somebody had, a very flexible man had decided that he could in fact recreate the death scene. And so he got into the bag, he padlocked himself from the outside, whereby God knows why he would do this. And then I guess the idea was that by sealing himself inside this thing, he was unable to get out and padlock.
I mean, this is the state of British intelligence. One guy worked out how this could have been suicide by spending weeks oiling his joints for a demonstration of how he could fold himself naked into an Adidas holdall and padlock it.
There was actually an inquest recently, though, and normally I'd like to believe the intelligence services were competent enough to do this, but the guy was apparently a claustrophilic, which is a sexual fetish about really liking to be locked up in very small spaces.
Yeah, that popped up last week, but was nowhere in the last 2 or 3 years worth of investigations, which is amusing.
I know, but I just like the fact that apparently that is a thing.
Well, we can't talk about it in New York, because if your kink is 1 in a million, then there are 7 other people in this.
And they're probably hears that. Another case of burglary that I thought was fascinating is a man in a bag sort of fantasy, where there were these 2 guys in Barcelona, and they came up with possibly the dumbest fucking plan I've ever heard. Where one of them would lock himself in a suitcase, a very heavy suitcase, mind you now, and so then the other guy would take him to the airport and put him onto the and then as this thing was going out to the airplane, he would unzip himself out of the suitcase, where he would have little, like he also had little empty duffel bags and what kind of stuff, and he'd rifle through everybody else's bags, he would take valuable things, stick them in a duffel bag, and then get back into the suitcase. And so the two absurd things about this is that it never worked. They were arrested, so there's not even one example of this thing being successful. But the deeply weird aspect was that the only reason I read about this thing was because it was used specifically as a geometry challenge in a children's textbook. You had to calculate, based on the size of the burglar, you had to calculate the internal volume of the suitcase. And that was a geometry exercise. It was called The Burglar in the Suitcase.
I never started going through my kids' homework.
A pair of guys did it on a bus.
What?
A pair of guys did it on a bus. They were doing it on bus lines. And the only reason they got busted was because the guy on top of the bus was talking to the guy below on a cell phone, and the other people on the bus heard him. But they gone to like 3 buses where people had like found things missing in their bags and couldn't figure out how it was until the 3rd time around they heard them on the cell phones and arrested the guy underneath the bus in the bag.
Apparently, these guys got busted because the suitcase was so heavy he was called in for suspicious activity.
Excess baggage weight.
Which is a couple really quick things. So, burglars are constantly getting busted by absurd means. Like another one of my favorite stories is in New Zealand, a burglar, and this happens all the time actually. I mean, not this specific example, but burglars doing dumb things. So a burglar broke into a house to hide from the police because they were coming for him. He crawled up into the ceiling and he hid himself amongst the insulation. But for some reason he didn't have any shoes or socks on. And they saw him because they saw his little fucking toe coming out of the insulation. And so like some sort of like rogue object moving through the world. They saw him and they saw this detached toe and they cleared the insulation and arrested him. But just briefly, like along the notion of agents, so like the burglary equivalent of that is FBI agents. And so one of the things I think is really, really interesting is that the FBI actually they're kind of like the world's best burglars. They have this thing that's called the Tactical Operations Squad. And actually the internal squad of people that arrange for breaking into, say, a mob leader's pool hall to put microphones in the lamps so that they can spy on what they might be talking about, or to get into the house of whatever suspected drug dealer and that kind of thing. They call on tactical operations, and tactical operations calls on this operation called stagehand. And so what's fascinating is that they're kind of like this operatic troupe moving through the world, tax-funded, and they break into mob bosses' homes. And so they do everything from examples like they had a piece of shrubbery that was on an umbrella, and if you popped open the umbrella, it would look like a bush. And then you could hide behind it while you picked a lock to get in. They would commandeer trucks and buses and park them in front of houses, and then use the truck as a kind of way to mask what's happening behind while they break into these buildings. They actually have, and this is where it just gets genuinely strange, they sometimes will show up with stilts. And so, like for instance, if this is a mob boss's house and you have to put a mic in the ceiling, a bug in the ceiling, you'll get a guy, an FBI agent, on stilts at like 2 o'clock in the morning, walking around inside this house, sticking bugs in the ceiling. And then on top of that, they do things that are absolutely magical. So, like as if they are deleted scenes from Harry Potter, they actually have little vials and envelopes full of dust. And what the idea being that if they come in and they disturb the dust on top of a stereo, or they disturb the dust on top of somebody's book because they accidentally put their hand down on it, they can sprinkle their own dust back down on it, and then hide the fact that they were there. And then on top of that, like sort of Zen, somewhere between like Zen gardeners and cat aficionados, they have these little rakes, like the kind of things you would use in a cat box or in a Zen garden. And they actually will rake out the traces of their own footsteps out of those carpets. And so as they disappear, they can make it look as if they were never there. They have ready-made objects, so if I go in and I need to, maybe I can't bug your lamp, but I can show up with a bugged lamp that's identical to the one you have. So it's almost like a personal shopper who's out to get you. And then to show just how insane these things get, there's a great anecdote from, it's a book by, I'm totally blanking on his name, but it's called The Secrets of the FBI. And he tells this one anecdote, which was that an FBI tactical operations team went into the embassy of a Soviet bloc country. It's never identified which one it was. And the guy has a heart attack. He dies. The FBI guy dies. He hits the floor. But apparently, what happens, unfortunately, is that he lost control of his bowels. So
which happens.
So he has a heart attack. He dies. And he shits all over the Oriental rug. And so they have to figure out what on earth do we do. We're in a Soviet bloc embassy. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. We better roll up the carpet and go to the dry cleaner. And so they go out to the dry cleaner and they get this thing cleaned of all the diarrhea. They come back, but it's still wet. So then they realize, and they also have like paint matching algorithms. So then they realize that, oh, you know what we could do? And the narrative thinking here is incredible. Like it's as if they're sort of struggling novelists. So they realize, oh, what we should do is repaint the ceiling, because then it'll look wet. And then we can say that a pipe had burst, and that the water had come out and caused bubbling in the paint. And therefore, the fresh paint is disguising a pipe burst that never happened. Which is also then subterfuge to
But the
hide
worst
the
thing
diarrhea.
about this is, if I put that in a book, my editor would send it and say, what is this bullshit? This is the worst thing about working on the edge of reality like that, is that if you tell it to an audience, they would believe you. If I'd read that in a story, they would have left.
I have a question about burglars.
Sure.
What's this thing about them having rights when they break into your home?
Well, it depends on where you are, actually, but in the UK in particular, it's kind of an extreme example, which is that any violence done to a burglar, and this is sort of changing now, is considered assault. And
Yeah,
so,
it's under the European Human Rights Act.
Yeah, so somebody can break into your house, and if you fight back in any way, actually, like if you throw something at them and it hits their back, they can sue you for damages.
That's technical assault in Britain. Burglars have human rights even when they're burglarising. There was a famous case about 3 years ago of a celebrity. Her house was being burgled, and she threw a bowling pin at the guy and brained him, and she got nicked because she had assaulted someone in her home, and her pleas of he was stealing shit out of my house in the middle of the night meant nothing. It contravened the European Human Rights Act.
It doesn't make any sense. Well, all right, speaking to that then, assassins, which you posit are providing a service, do they have rights?
Well, not so much. Because that's extra legal from the top. Yeah. There's not really human rights in place. Well, you know, I accidentally killed this person with a sniper rifle from 200 yards away. No. There's no wiggle room really for hitting, sadly.
What if you hurt them while they break into your home and try to kill you? Is that considered assault also?
No, they're trying to kill you, I think. I think that actually
That
happened.
falls into self-defense?
That's self-defense.
In Britain, it's actually tricky because you have to prove intent. If you've gone into someone's house to kill them but haven't killed them yet, and then Mrs. Smith hits you with a rolling pin, provided you're not found unconscious and heavily armed, you then would have legal wiggle room to say, well, I just wanted to use the phone. I was going to steal the super sugar ice. It wasn't there to shoot it through the head. And then you would have the law on your side. It's trickier in Britain because obviously hitmen prefer firearms, and firearms are controlled in Britain.
What's really intent, actually, just briefly, you can extrapolate intent in at least in in U.S. burglary law by the way in which you enter a structure. So obviously, like if you go through the side door when you could have gone through the front, even if you don't steal anything, you can make the legal case, and you can successfully make the legal case that there's no reason why you would have used the side door if you hadn't been intending to commit burglary inside the structure, even if you didn't take anything. And so the way in which you enter a building can actually be considered a crime, which I think is interesting.
So I was going to say in the U.S., you obviously advocate your human rights when you burgle something or, break into the structure. So, but I was going to say, what other cultural differences have you noticed in terms of like these nitpicky definitions of what is burglary, what isn't?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of them. I mean, some of them are actually, some of the most interesting are the way in which police respond to it. So those are cultural differences. Like one that just for some reason stuck out because I had like 6 science fiction novel ideas out of this was that in Poland, apparently, like the police response to a burglary can be like almost aggressively thorough. And so if you've been burgled, it's like a Terry Gilliam thing gone wrong where they will take over your apartment. You can't get back in, you can't access your goods, and they sort of forensically and very scientifically analyze to great detail and for a very long time what might have happened. But then the funny thing too is that they also have an incredibly bad success rate in capturing burglars. It's like doing an incredibly detailed forensic science experiment inside someone's apartment and not looking for the burglar who's by now. So little things like that I think are pretty fascinating. But then like differences in city. Like another example is that a couple months ago I was in Chicago and I took a lockpicking course with a bunch of people, including a guy who on the back of his neck it said paranoid. He had a big paranoid tattoo. And we started talking about how all of his coworkers were like picking locks and getting into the shotgun cabinet. And so I finally said, what do you do for a living? Like why on earth do you have all these guns lying around? And it turns out he's a Chicago Police Department officer. And so anyway, so we started talking about like legal differences and burglary tools and all that kind of thing. But so, to make a long story short, what's interesting is that in Chicago, or rather in Illinois, if I have lockpicking tools and I hand them to Warren, I have committed a felony. But if I drive over the state border into Indiana, we can exchange lockpicking tools for the rest of our lives, and then just drive back into Illinois, and we're not guilty of anything. So you can, in other words, you can possess lockpicking tools, but you can't give them to anyone else. So, in any case, things like that are pretty interesting. So yeah, there's little differences like that, and I could go into much greater detail, but they exist.
One of the things you mentioned, you were talking about the line between theft and burglary and public space and private space. So of course that might, it's okay. So you think burglary, you think usually, like museums, which a lot of them are privately owned, or homes, or what have you. Now, can you burgle a public space, a publicly owned space? Is that a thing that can actually happen? Or is that considered restriction of property or defacement of property, or how does that deal?
Yeah, it's a good question. You can very definitely be accused, obviously, of trespass and theft, and you could be and would be found guilty of burglary against public if you've entered a structure.
Right.
But I mean, it would be interesting. You can't burgle something that's in the middle of Union Square, for instance. That would just be theft because you haven't actually entered something, unless it's in one of those gazebos, or unless it's on. I mean, the thing is, like, a really tricky person that wants to sort of like fuck everybody could actually walk around with like a little umbrella and argue that they have a clothes around them, and then if I reach in and take something out of your pocket, I could potentially make the argument that the umbrella is an architectural structure according to Renaissance Italian architectural canon, and that, so technically speaking, you have entered into my architectural space, etc. So I mean, you can.
So if anyone was bored tomorrow,
It is supposed to rain.
I saw a hand go up from over there.
Yeah, question for Jeff. Legal differences aside, are there some city plans or some ways of organizing architectural space which like promote theft more than others, or like burglary more than others? Like,
Well, yeah, there definitely are. I mean, actually, in Warren's homeland, there's a fun thing called what is it? It's a way that police involve themselves in the architectural process. And so an architect will go to the police and show them what they have, and the police will make little zips and swishes and say, no, you have to do X, Y, and Z. You have to shut down certain corner access and that kind of thing. But houses on cul-de-sacs get burgled less than houses that are on straight streets. Houses on corners, or rather buildings on corners, get burgled much, much more because you can see in all directions and you have many ways to get away. Little things like storm glass in your windows can keep people from breaking in because there are too many panes of glass to break. Little things like that, but they're not universal rules at all. One of the guys who was most fascinating was a Canadian burglar who claims to be retired and only spoke to me anonymously, but very many long back and forths about this, where he's basically learned how to read building. He's in Toronto, and the Toronto fire code is so specific. I think this is fascinating. So the regulation of architectural space is so specific that you can actually look at a building from the outside and deduce the layout, how many people live there, where the internal fire escapes and doors will be for staircases in there, and therefore judge, before you even enter, how you will get out, what floors you might want to hit, and blah, blah, blah. So in a sense, knowing fire code or knowing the code of the city is this really interesting way to misuse that knowledge in a way that you can sort of predict how things will be inside a building. And that's another reason why I think like burglars actually seem to know architecture better than architects do. The glasses? I don't know glasses.
Warner joked earlier that you would put that in a novel that your editor would have dismissed it and said it was too ridiculous.
Yeah.
Has there ever been an instance of that actually happening? There was something you wanted to...
I usually catch it myself first because I follow up. What happens to me most often is that I think of something that I think is fiction, and then 2 months later it happens. Let me tell you, that is really fucking annoying. No, I mean, if you're looking for the one thing that makes me want to kill, I thought of this and it came true before I could publish it. That's frustrating. There's been. I remember there was a comics artist who, I guess before parkour was well known, didn't believe in it. So he kicked the script back and said, "Why isn't the character just climbing a ladder or something sensible?" And it took another year or two for parkour to become mainstream. So little things like that, not the big stuff, because I tend to watch, when I'm writing, I will tend to watch the news a lot. I never read fiction when I'm writing, I only read non-fiction. Because I'm constantly aware that, firstly, I need to convince an editor that what I'm talking about is somewhat feasible, and secondly, I need to know when to pull a piece, because it's happened.
Speaking to fiction, non-fiction, what is your favorite, if you had to say your favorite murder fiction, and what's your favorite burglary fiction? Or movie or book, I guess.
Favourite murder fiction? That's a tough one, actually. I mean, I used to love the early John Woo films, which were mostly about hitmen and hitmen, cops, and this wonderful myth they promulgated that in any movie it only takes one bullet to kill a white guy. But if you're an Asian, it's going to take upwards of 200. White guys are shit. Asian guys, hardest men on earth. I always loved that. I mean, hard boiled. I mean, the last hour and 10 minutes is just Chow Yun-fat getting shot. And he's still alive at the end of it. Perversely, maybe The Name of the Rose. Because, I mean, it is a murder story. But it's tied up in such peculiar religious hate. And illustrates so well the oddest things that some people consider murder-worthy in others. Simply being able to laugh in someone's vision, in someone's world, that makes you worth killing. You have the ability to laugh. So yeah, maybe The Name of the Rose.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a tough question. I guess maybe I'd say two things. One is just the premise of a book. Like the book itself isn't that great, but it's called, I think it's called The Score by Donald Westlake. And the premise is awesome, which is that there's a little isolated mining town in Montana or North Dakota, and it has one road in and one road out. And if they have enough guys, they can just rob the whole fucking town. And so that's what they do. They rob the whole town.
Is that one of the Parker books?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then, I don't know, yeah, there's a lot of really good films, but I guess actually, I mean, one of my favorite heist movies is actually Die Hard. Like, I just think it's an amazing movie about breaking in. And in fact, every aspect of the movie is a misuse of the skyscraper in a really fascinating way. So you can watch the entire movie they go down elevator shafts, they go through air ducts instead of hallways, they shoot their way through walls that are still under construction. I mean, it's like a Pyrenean fantasy of architecture gone wrong. And then on top of it, he jumps off the roof and comes back inside through a window. And so it's as if you assembled a whole bunch of people who had no idea how to use a building. And you turn that into an action film. So that's a Die.
I remember arriving on I think it's the Warner's set earlier this year, and I got in the car and turned around, and they just repainted some of the sides of the set buildings, and I turned around, and there is like this 60-foot long close-up painting of Bruce in Die Hard. And it was fucking terrifying. I turned around and there's Bruce just filling my entire field of vision. You know, my entire body was the size of one of his eyes. And it's disturbing architecture. and of course, this being the Warner's lot, directly over the road is a standing 1920s set. Have you ever been out there?
Not that particular place.
No, you'd find it interesting because of the chaotic confusion. There is really no plan. It's perfectly fine to have the Simpsons set. Giant scary picture of Bruce Willis, 1920s New York. Literally 3 points from the car park. It's...
Speaking of murder fiction, I believe I've read that you're a big fan of Alan Moore's From Hell. And I was just wondering, like, you know, Jack the Ripper is so popular in pop culture, and what do you think is the difference between, like, you talk about just murderers, but what's the difference between them and serial murderers or pathological murderers?
I mean, Jack the Ripper is actually the perfect iteration of the Hashishita. It's death without any explanation. Nobody knows why those 5 women were killed. Nobody knows. There are a great many theories, and there's a great deal of evidence to support a great many of those theories. Nobody knows. And that's why it continues to haunt us. We're talking about a very, very dense part of London. Whitechapel is almost literally over the road from the financial centre of the city. Whitechapel back then was crammed with people. These 5 women were killed in horrific and very, very elaborate ways. Nobody saw it happen. Nobody knows why it happened. And that's why it continues. It's the puzzle we have no code for. And so we're driven to pick at it in a way, in a drive to try and make it make sense. And it never ever will. That's why Jack the Ripper continues to haunt everybody, I think.
Should we just do one more and then?
Yeah.
Just drinking. Do you want to question on that?
2 questions. Or have you looked into the Panthers for burglary at all? And then for you, there was something I saw on the History Channel not too long ago about a killer based out of Chicago who had an entire block that he used as a hotel he created. And at the World's Fair, he used to take people, or he would take people from the World's Fair and actually kill them. And there was thought that he would also sell bodies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Skeletons. And he had certain tricks that seemed to correlate with Jack the Ripper, and there was thought that he might have been the person.
Yeah, there were always rumours that the Jack the Ripper had moved to Chicago and set up shop in Chicago and continued working there.
That's H.H. Holmes.
Yes.
Nice.
Oh, and then in terms of intent of like serial killers and stuff like that, have you looked much into the way their bodies are kept or left that dictates the mindset of the serial killer?
Yeah, I serial killers. I mean, we're getting into pathological killing as opposed to straight up, if you like, murder. Because it is a different thing. Murder, as far as I'm concerned, murder is simply the most extreme expression of dissatisfaction with your life. When you're getting into serial killing, you're getting into something else entirely. You're getting into patterns, you're getting into compulsions. You're getting into expressing something other than the unhappiness with your life that characterises domestic murder. So yeah, I mean, that's been a long time fascination, on and off, because there's really only so much of that you can read at any one time, I think. Other people disagree with me, but you know, Patton Oswalt's got a bit in one of his sets, because his now wife writes and researches true crime. And he'll come home from a day's work, how are you, sweetie? What you're watching, and you know, there's someone being disemboweled on the screen, and they're talking about how this guy wore the skin of so many, and there's only so much of that before you go and find a bar. For most people, I think was probably his point. But yeah, I mean, it's endlessly fascinating.
No, yeah, the Pink Panthers that you asked about are Balkan robbers who are well known for brazen acts of jewel theft, and they're operating all over the world, and it's pretty interesting. They're not a huge part of my book in the sense that they rob and burgle, but in a way that isn't necessarily architecturally compelling. It's a lot of smash and grab. It's a lot of decoy, distraction, robbery, and that kind of thing. But there's a kind of the U.S. almost equivalent of that. These guys, who are known by law enforcement as YAKs, which stands for Yugoslavia, Albania, Croatia, and Serbia. And they are really good at breaking into buildings in funny ways. So like they will cut holes in ceilings and rappel down in all mountain gear. And they rob a lot of supermarkets, and they come in, and there's some really famous examples where they rappel in. It's really interesting actually. It's like a topologically interesting scenario because they will come in through the ceiling and technically really not touch anything. They don't get down to the floor. It's kind of like Mission Impossible. Yeah, they hang. They're really well positioned to do this. They'll take money out of cash registers, out of the back vault, and then go back up into the ceiling. So
it's the full Tom Cruise, only they're hitting a Costco.
Yeah. And they're robbing a Piggly Wiggly in Alabama. They're from Albania. But it's like this topological insertion of the burglar into the architectural space, the volume of the building, and then the removal of objects from that building and disappearing.
It's working in volume, not plain now.
Yeah.
Yeah. How are we doing for time? I need to get rid of this here.
Yeah, why don't we...
Oh, good man. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, why don't we leave it there, and then, yeah, we'll hang out and we can get some drinks and stuff, but thanks for coming out. Thanks for